Welcome to episode 131 of Silver Lining for Learning. Find a place for Stanford's Code in Place. See, at Stanford, they've been teaching people how to code, not just at 30 or 40 or 50 students or a large section in college class of 100 or 200 students. We might be talking thousands of students. And they just had maybe the second iteration of it with more than 10,000 students and upwards of 900 volunteer instructors helping out. And we have the three people who have instigated this project to reflect on what they've accomplished this semester as well as last spring and where they might be going in the future. It's about scalability, and Silver Lining for Learning for the last 2+ years, almost 3 now, have been focused a bit on that notion of scalability and innovative pedagogy, which is part and parcel of what they're up to, as well as new models of education and the future of education. This show encapsulates all 4 of those pieces. So Chris Beach will be the lead in this one, at least what I'm reading online. He's taking the lead in this project, but he's also highly supported by Julie Zielinski and Mehran Sahami, who were his mentors in graduate school at Stanford. And he's apparently stayed on there. He loved it so much in the Bay Area. So I welcome the 3 of you from the West Coast. Would you like to give us a little bit of background of yourselves and this program to start us off? And maybe we can do a round robin of all 3 of you. And maybe we should go to Mehran, who was your advisor, Chris, and have him explain what his background is and how what led to this project. And then we'll go around to Julie and then end with Chris. How's that?
Well, thanks very much for having us on, Kurt. Really appreciate it. I think part of the Code in Place project, the genesis for it was really, Chris was thinking about how do we help people during the pandemic. So in terms of my background, going back a little bit further, we have a program at Stanford for section leaders, which is a way for undergrads to actually be able to teach sections at a ratio of about 10 students per 1 instructor. And that's a way that we can create more scale for a class that usually has around 500 or 600 students in it. And that idea has been so successful that, when the pandemic was happening, the idea was, could we bring that to more people? And bringing together a team of folks to be able to really pull that off, I think, is part of what Chris can really put in the energy and the effort to make it all happen. So, I'll let him tell the whole story of how it came together, but there's kind of this bedrock of that section leading program, which is what this got layered on.
Muted there. It reminds me of Chuck Severance's program at Michigan, teaching Python programming and programming for everybody. He brings in alums of the program to teach other people and be his community leaders. I don't know if you've heard of Chuck Severance, but he was the head of Sakai for a while in that project too. So maybe we should go on to Julie.
Hey there, welcome. Thank you for inviting us. We want to get the word out widely about the things that we're up to and hope we will inspire people to either join us in it or to, grow the program, broadly everywhere, right? I would say my particular part of this was I was particularly interested in the volunteer section leader part. And as much as I love computer science and teaching and want to teach a bunch of students, I also think there's a great amount of joy and opportunity in giving people a chance to teach. It's one of the most, I think rewarding. I mean, I've spent my life doing it, so it's been, really part of what has kept me motivated and excited about our field as it continues to develop and grow and work toward that. And being a part of helping new people, putting that hand out, as Mehran said, right, even as a sophomore, a junior, right, just a year, a class ahead of the ones who are coming behind you and saying, I can take the skills I've built, right, and I can help you learn how to debug. I can help you learn how a for loop works. I can help you learn to think about data structures. It's just a really fun and wonderful way to kind of use your knowledge, right, and share. So, so the role I was particularly interested in is how do we get people, worldwide, right, like college students, retired people who've had long and storied careers, people who are working as lawyers, people who were old alums of our program, stepping up and leading a little section and helping another, generation of programmers come to the same knowledge they had, which was really fun.
When you go to the website, and if you're watching the show later and you download the episode or click on the link to the Stanford News article, the very last line talks about what Julie just said. to use technology, the broad reach of technology, and the compassion and humanity of people helping each other. That's the way the article ends. It's about humanity and compassion and assistance and support and so forth. It's wonderful. Chris.
Hi, my name is Chris. I grew up in Kenya, Malaysia, but I've been at Stanford for a long time, and similar to Maron, I think Julie is, or to both Maron and Julie, I had a big change of life when I got to play the role that Julie just described. At some point, I was hired to be a section leader, and I got to teach 10 people back when I was an undergraduate. And I believe the first class I section led for was actually for Maron when I was a 19-year-old. I'm now 34. And then it sparked something in me. It changed my identity in a deep way. I think it was one of the more profound experiences I had, not just because I learned more about computer science or I practiced speaking, but that connection with other people, the job that had some giving in it really spoke to what motivated myself. And then, I got to work more with Julie, my first TA position. And then when I became a PhD student, I really got interested in how we could scale education. That just became the focus of my PhD. I was really interested in AI at the time. So you can imagine I went down the traditional route of trying to figure out how we could use machines to help. But all the while, I feel like the answer was in the ethos of this wonderful teaching community at Stanford. We're trying to think about how to scale education, but there's all these people getting wonderful experiences by teaching. So when the pandemic happened, and I think Maron and I got on a phone call, we're like, we have to figure out a way to help people. And Maron pointed out, we can't go make defibrillators or oxygen machines, but we could teach. We decided that this one part was the thing we were most interested in figuring out if we could bring to folks. And originally it was to help us scale high quality, but I think through the process, we learned that it's a pretty nice experience too for people to get their first teaching shot. And so Code in Place was born.
Fascinating. Chris is going to jump in with a question here.
So is this the course that residential students at Stanford also take, or is this a different course?
I could jump in, but everyone could answer this. So CS 106A is the residential course, and we took the material from the first half of CS 106A. So there were two separate instances. There was an instance for 106A and an instance for Code in Place, and Code in Place did that first half. So there was a lot of similarities, but I would call them different courses.
Okay. And in fact, when we were doing that class, we were basically Code in Place was 2 weeks behind the Stanford class. And so we teach the lectures for the Stanford class and then take some of those materials and augment them in certain ways. But that was the same material that we would then pass on to the Code in Place students.
And how would you contrast the two experiences? Because I can imagine cynics saying, oh, all these other people would have dragged down the quality of the discussion compared to students who were smart enough to get into Stanford. And I can imagine advocates saying, boy, the open course would be better because you'd get this incredible range of talent and diversity. So I'm interested in how you would contrast the two on different dimensions.
I don't know. You want me to try to that's a tough one. I mean, I guess I don't think of it as thinking about the quality or what they were able to achieve. I think what was really interesting was to see how motivated these students were, right? That we had, 20,000 people kind of express interest and be willing to do an application. We had them do a little bit of problem solving to kind of gauge their willingness to see it through. I mean, online courses are kind of notorious for having incredibly high attrition rates, right? A bunch of people kind of jump up, they hear Stanford's doing something and they want in, but they're not totally willing to see it through, or maybe if the going gets a little bit rough, right, they might lose a little bit of their motivation. And I think what the human connection about Code in Place was a really important part of keeping the community working together and supporting each other. So we had a really vibrant forum. We used a tool out of Australia called EdSTEM that allowed us to have these just 1,000-person discussions and support for each other and finding of community, and the small group sections, right, with your section leader who's kind of tending to a small, cluster of 10 students and meeting them weekly, I think really builds, into it a sense of accountability and togetherness that really helped. We had really incredible completion rate, which was, really satisfying to us as people who want to get the word out about how cool it is to learn to program.
I mean, building off what Julie said, wasn't it kind of nice that we didn't have to give grades? There was this difference that the in-person class, we had to give grades, we had to assess people. People felt judged, and there was a sense of they had to prove themselves. Where in the online class, it was just for the joy of learning. And we said that from the beginning, like, come here so that you can learn this wonderful skill. And I must say, as a teacher, to have a class that's just filled with people who only want to be there for the learning's sake, that was kind of fun.
And the community was pretty incredible. It's one of the most amazing online communities in terms of support I've seen, which is something that you get because there are so many people involved, right? So if you consider even the 5% of people were to help out in a class of 100 students, that's 5 students that might want to help. In a class of 10,000 students, that's 500 students that help. And so it always creates a vibrancy on that discussion board. There's always people encouraging each other. The internet is sort of known for being a cesspool of comments that make people angry. And I have to say, when I would read the stuff on EdSTEM, I'd go read it every morning because it made me happy. It made for a better day. And that was just the kind of community we had.
So I've been studying self-directed learning for about at least 10 years or more. And Chris, I just got an article accepted, a review of the research on SDL will come out next month in distance education. I'll send you. But we've had 15 guidelines paper came out last month. I've also got 2 books on motivation online that are free. I will put in the chat window here, or I'll send it to Chris and he can go forward to y'all. So I want to ask a question about motivation later. First, I want to ask a question about challenges. What challenges did you face early on in this to set this up? What were some of the things that you had to overcome initially, even self-doubt, or your identity as an instructor? And what are the new challenges that you're facing now if you were to offer another iteration of this in the spring or next year? So what were the ones you've overcome? Maybe what are the ones you haven't overcome yet, and what ones you're going to face in the future if you've tried to expand this? And you're all laughing, so you must have a lot of them.
I mean, let's start with the self-doubt one. Like, we went into this, we had no idea, right? Would 5 students show up or 500,000, right? Would we get 5 volunteer teachers or 500,000? We learned time zones. Here's a fact that I didn't know until we got there was there are time zones that are not just an hour off from others, right? There's these places in India that are half hours off. Like, trying to figure out how to kind of work worldwide and around worldwide scheduling and cultural norms and it was that there were so many things that we were so innocent and so, I don't know, clueless in some ways, right, about what we were facing, that we bought a lot for ourselves on just raw enthusiasm, right? Of, well, we're going to do something that's never been done before, and we were brave enough and foolhardy enough maybe to kind of go for it.
Yeah, that balance is interesting, right? Because we wanted this ecosystem, and it was going to have 1,000 section leaders and 10,000 students. But first of all, like Julie mentioned, like getting the applications so that you have the right number of people showing up to the class, that was hard. And then once people are in the class, maintaining the balance is hard. I think certainly one of the things that we are always thinking about is how to make sure the 1,000 section leaders are always having a wonderful experience. And a lot of people finish the class, but not everybody. And one of the things that we've been thinking about a lot over the last year is, if by the end of the class you start as a section leader, it's possible that many of your sectionees will decide to drop out. Now, maybe for many section leaders this won't happen, but if there's 1,000 section leaders, certainly for a few. And so finding that dynamic teaching balance so that every teacher, when they have energy to teach, is always put in front of exactly who would benefit the most. That turned out to be a fascinating problem, and one I think we've gotten quite a lot better at after a few cycles.
Moran, you have a addition to that?
Well, I'd say, just when you scale things at that scale, all of the things that would be anomalous become normal, right? So if you think of there are certain things that are anomalous cases that happen 1% of the time. Well, a class of 10,000 people, that's going to happen to 100 people, right? It's not anomalous at all, and it's something you have to deal with. And with 1,000 section leaders, it's going to happen to 10 of your section leaders. So, luckily in the first iteration, things worked out pretty well where the section leaders, you would think with 1,000 of them, we'd actually have more attrition. The attrition rate was actually extremely low. But, in the midst of a pandemic, people will get sick, right? And so those are kinds of some of the things you have to deal with as you go along with that kind of scale. So you just have to be prepared for all the things that would otherwise be anomalies because they're just going to happen at that scale.
It leads us to questions whether there's a community of instructors out there supporting each other and the volunteers, but that's for later in the show. Maybe we'll get to that. But I'll point out that we had 3 shows recently on people from India that Punya led, and so we had to worry about that half-hour time issue. Punya, you want to jump in here?
Sure. I mean, not only the half hour, I completely forgot about the fact that the daylight savings kicked in, and so the schedule went wacky because of that. So that's despite my being originally from India and dealing with it on an everyday basis, talking to relatives. But anyway, thank you again. I mean, this is such an exciting project. I think like Kurt said, he has 10 or 11 questions. I have a bunch, but let me start with one that one of our longtime listeners, Bob Nelson, asked on the YouTube chat, which is were there certifications provided for people who completed?
The short answer is no, there weren't. We really told people you're in this for the joy of learning. And certainly there was questions about, could we get certificates? But we said, hey, the skill itself is what really matters here. Being certified that you've done the first half isn't what's important, but can you really solve problems using these tools? That can really matter. And students bought it. I think they were into that and they appreciated it. We did certify our section leaders. So if you came and you taught, we gave a certificate of accomplishment to those 1,000 people.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So that's awesome that that people were doing this for the love of it, because that's at the end of the day what you want, right, in education per se. But I'm glad you brought about this certificate for the section leaders, because that was my question really, because you had sort of you said that you had some kind of a problem that people had to solve in order to get into the program. I think the bigger challenge really is finding those, I think what was a 900 volunteer teachers. So how do you, everybody wants to be that, right? Who wants to be this guy who's learning and when I could be teaching? How do you determine whether not only that they have the skills, because they need to know the technical skills, but there is a thing called pedagogical content knowledge, that how you can take content and transform, convert it in a way that makes sense to the learner who don't know that, right? I mean, usually people who become experts in the field, they have this curse of knowledge. They have forgotten what it was to not know that. And that actually can be a big barrier to teaching. So that was the thing that actually struck me, that you got like 900 people and how you identified them and how you set their tasks and so on, so that they felt supported and scaffolded in what must have been a new experience for them.
I think I'll jump on that one, because I can tell you intimately how all those steps work. So one thing is we use this model of sort of 10-to-1 a couple different times, right? So there was the 10-to-1 ratio of students to section leaders. We actually took 10 section leaders and put them in with a mentor teacher at sort of a ratio of 10-to-1, right? And then we actually had the mentor teacher sort of work with us. I had a small team of graduate students who work with me, right, to kind of build that. And so we were kind of using this kind of pyramid scheme, shall we say, right, to spread the knowledge around. And we did, every week, right, we'd be sending out materials. Like we didn't throw them in the classroom sort of, kind of blind, figure it out. It was like, we have, we would talk through the material that was going to be covered in the lectures. We'd have section problems prepared. We had an online workspace tool we were using. So, prepared a lot of stuff for them and kind of made it an easy lift for them to go into the classroom with these materials, right, and deliver. So the question was, well, how do we know somebody's going to have that, going to be able to kind of step into that role? And in this case, this is a brilliant idea. This was Chris's. It's like, well, what we really needed to see was them do a little bit of teaching. We didn't, I don't want to hear a teaching statement. I don't want to, tell me about, I was like, give us a little video. And so we had them do a 5-minute video of talking through a certain problem in Python. And it was like, no high production value here, just like, show us what it would be like for you to explain to somebody how to get through this problem. And it was amazing. 5 minutes actually was too long, it turns out, because there were so many of these 5-minute videos, right, we needed to watch. Like 3 minutes is enough. You get right away a sense of where someone's sort of going to be at in terms of that gift they have for trying to talk somebody through something and showing the light, on it and getting them there. And it was magical how much you could tell from just a little glimpse into the presence they would bring to that, that allowed us to do. I mean, we had really high success rates, like in terms of people doing a great job, getting great, feedback from the sectionees who were in their section, as well as people just sticking through with the program. And then going above and beyond, people who wanted to do extra teaching and spent time on the forum or had extra help sessions, right? I think the call really pulled out this group of people, I think, who wanted this experience more than anything and were really prepared to kind of go all out, which was super wonderful.
Thank you. The 10:1 ratio really resonates with me because we did a similar thing with a STEM program in Chicago, and that's a really good ratio because again, you have to think about scalability and personalization, right? Is that tension there? So I don't know if Mehran or Chris want to add anything to that.
Well, there was also, as Julie mentioned, the selection process. So I think in the first iteration, we had around 1,200 people apply to be section leaders. And that got winnowed down to 900 that were kind of above the bar from watching the videos and, looking at other kinds of things. But there was also lots of students who, after the first iteration of the class, wanted to then be section leaders for the next iteration of the class. And so that has a lot of potential to think about how a model like this can perpetuate itself in the long term, where the students, again, in this near peer model, not in the sense of age, but in the sense of when they learn the material, are now ready to remember what it was like when they were struggling with it and help someone else to go through it and become part of a community. And, as we all know, when you teach something, you learn it even better. So we think there's lots of additional follow-on effects there as well.
Can I try speaking to something a little bit subtle? So at Stanford, Julie, Mehran, and this wonderful team of teachers who they spend their lives teaching computer science, have created a community that goes so deep. They've inspired myself, but not just myself. Every year, hundreds of people like myself have been section leaders in our core classes. And we've really gotten excited about teaching and the craft itself. And so they've done this for, 3 decades. And after 3 decades, there's so many people who feel it in their hearts. So when we started this program, certainly, Mehran, Julie, myself worked really hard, but also hundreds of people came out from the woodworks who had been part of the program as students and helped. And when we said we need to look at 1,300 5-minute videos, we had a huge team of people helping us with that task. And that volunteer spirit was part pandemic, but also part of what happens when you create a community of teaching. And the reason I call this subtle is because maybe that's one of the dreams of where we could get to, is we pass on that joy of teaching to many other people around the world, and hopefully they take on projects and do neat things in their own communities.
So thank you, guys. This is
Thank you.
It's like this is beautiful. It's like a dream. It's like you're running a mega church. Okay, so take the church out, run a mega church, and I love that. But I mean, you guys also started the MOOCs at Stanford. So my curiosity, I have so many. Okay, so because rich schools like Stanford and Harvard should all run classes like this for all over the world, and this is kind of my dream in thinking. And I said that, Mary and Julie and Chris, you guys are too happy. You're very happy people on this one. So my curiosity really has to do with the institution. How does Stanford treat this? Do they treat this as part of your job? Or do they say, well, this is something you're having fun? Or are they going to try to monetize on your course in the future? Or are you going to run your Python Institute global in the future? I'm not sure. I just would like to hear your thinking, reflection. Maybe you don't want to think about that, but you are, after all, like employee of Stanford. So in many ways, but you are not bringing tuition for them. So if you don't want to feel comfortable saying that, that's fine. Because but this is, every professor kind of faces those kind of challenges, even if they want to do something good. Can you share with us what you guys are thinking about that, running a mega church?
Well, I don't know about mega church, because certainly we believe in the grassroots part, but in terms of support from Stanford, that is a very interesting story, because when we started, we weren't sure how they would respond. So at some point I had to call up my higher ups and ask for permission. And I do remember the first phone call, I'm still like, hey, it's a pandemic time. We're thinking about doing this community service project. It'll be for free. People won't get credit, and it'll be the first half of our intro class. And the response was this. They said, oh, great, just make sure you learn something. Try something new, see if you can share some knowledge with the world. And that was what they required. Now, I think that speaks to a higher order mission at Stanford, is that the university, I'd say, is changing. And I think they see themselves as hopefully contributing to the global community. And it's not just us who thinks that. I think if you look even up to like the board of directors, I think that's something they all want to see Stanford do more of. And I found that surprising. I think a lot of us found it surprising, but there's a lot of support behind us. I don't think they'll ever monetize. There's zero pressure to monetize. In fact, some alumni of Code in Place have now donated some money so we can keep doing this for the next few years. I think they're happy that it's supported.
I think the broader mission of the university very much speaks to it. And I think, as Chris mentioned with the board of directors, from that level all the way down, we see it. We even see it externally. So last year we had a visiting committee, do traditional kind of committee of academics, people from industry, come and look at the department. And one of the things that came out of their report was that they liked the fact that we were doing outreach and trying to provide more educational opportunities from things that we'd learned or developed here to more of the world, and that we should really continue to do that. And so from that standpoint, there's backing externally as well. And I think, we've gotten lots of support from the department, from the School of Engineering, from the university more broadly. But the fact that even outside of the university, people point to it and say, this is what you should be doing as part of the broader educational mission, gives it an additional heft to be able to continue to maintain the momentum.
So I feel a little like the Grinch in having to ask this question, but I really want to know what the students actually learned. I understand that they were motivated. I understand that they got to see good online teaching, that they felt part of a learning community. They could brag to the neighbor that they're enrolled in something at Stanford. Those are all tangible goods. But I am curious as to how much coding they actually learned and how you would compare where they were with people who took the first half of the residential course. And I ask this not out of any skepticism about online learning, because Georgia Tech has an online master's degree that has been studied very extensively, and the students coming out have an identical set of skills to those in the residential course, which they're paying a lot more for. But this isn't, as you said, this isn't credit bearing. So I just would like to know, beyond all of the other benefits, what proportion of the students learn a comparable amount of coding to the students in the residential program?
That's a deep question. One of the ways of answering is how we define completion. We define completion by doing the 3 assignments, and the 3 assignments were parallel to the Stanford assignments. You first have to do an intro set of programs where you have to make a robot solve Turing complete problems. Then you have to write a series of console programs, including one that creates math quizzes for users of your program to take. And then we did an image processing assignment, which paralleled the first 3 assignments in CS 106A. Of the people who took Code in Place, a little bit over 50% of people did those first 3 assignments. And then we had an optional last one. I think, we did try and make it seem welcoming. And as you said, there were some people who were coming from less supported backgrounds than you can imagine our average student. And so we did try and just to make sure that people could complete if they wanted to. So there was a lot of support. We didn't monitor it as closely. Maybe people got help on the forum and were able to make it through. So it's hard to compare, but on paper, what they have done are 3 pretty hefty programming assignments.
And I think one of the other learnings that came out of it is the difference in context between the traditional academic context that is about credit and credentialing versus the context of come join us in this process for the love of learning. And we saw that people had very different goals from what they wanted to get out of the program. And so the notion of what did they learn was actually different for different people. Some people just wanted a sense of community. They were in the midst of a pandemic. They were isolated. And this was a common factor in bringing together community. And so for them, the learning process was just being part of that community, and coding was the thing that brought them together. There were other people that just wanted exposure. They wanted to understand what this whole programming endeavor was about. They didn't necessarily want to keep programming afterwards, but they wanted to understand, what does my computer do? There was a lot of people who I think wanted to learn something about programming for, their own facility. If they're working with spreadsheets or they're doing something where I want to keep track of some data at home, now I have some facility to be able to do that. And there were even people who were looking at it as a first step in a career change. And we actually heard from several people afterwards that said they actually did do that career change. They took this class, they followed up with additional resources, and they proudly would send us an email saying, I just got my first job at X company. Right. And Code in Place was the start for doing that. And so from that spectrum of learning, I think one of the things that was very important for us is when you scale it out of the traditional academic context, people are looking for different things. And so it's important to have those hooks in there to give different people different experiences.
So this is fascinating. It really is. For people watching the show or listening to the show in the podcast format, you might want to look at Arizona State's program called 100 Million Learners Project. This sounds very, very similar notion. You also might want to go back to a previous show we had on with Paul Kim. I wanted to make you guys aware, maybe if you don't know Paul Kim, he's at Stanford School of Education, and he runs the SMILE project, which you may know about, the Stanford Mobile Inquiry Learning Environment. He had a MOOC 10 years ago using one of the Stanford MOOC platforms, it was called Designing a New Learning Environment. And he had 20,000 students supporting each other. And he wrote a chapter in one of my MOOCs books I'll try and send to you, but he talks about how to create an ecology of learners, supporting each other in group work, teamwork, so forth from around the world, and how to scale that up. And that's really important. And I also had a student do a dissertation on macromedia user groups. And it was fascinating to see why people go to these Google user groups or Macromedia user groups or Adobe and whatnot. What motivated them to do this for free, to volunteer, to teach other people how to get involved in a user group. And the incentives were just to use their knowledge that they had. They were bored in their day job, and this gave them something to do that was exciting and relevant and was helping the human species out in some way. So that was fascinating. And I wonder, and you already have spoken to that, I guess, but if you were to look at the motivational incentives, both from the volunteers standpoint and from the student standpoint, you've started to list them, feedback being one, I guess a sense of self-efficacy as an instructor. Could you kind of describe what are the motivational incentives that you've tried to put into this ecology of learning, or the ones that have evolved and you've become more aware of? And I'll let anyone jump in.
I could start. I'll start by building off something that Meron left off with, that a bunch of people had their careers change after Code in Place, which is fantastic, and certainly that was disproportionately true for the volunteer section leaders. And maybe one of the surprising things that we've learned, and Schoolhouse.World did a similar program for teaching high school math. They learned the same thing. There's huge demand to be a near peer mentor, like our volunteer section leaders were, and in all cases, it seems that the demand to be a volunteer section leader might even outpace how many students we can teach. And you might find that puzzling at first, but then if you dive into what the experience is, it's actually pretty fantastic. Where in the world can you get your first experience teaching? Maybe in your current institution, but if your institution doesn't offer you a chance to teach, there's not that many opportunities. Teaching is a great way to learn, but it's also a great way to start your career. If you go to apply for a job and said, well, I've been a university student, that might be helpful. But if you apply to a job and say, I've been a university student, I've been a teacher as well. And while as a teacher, I hone my basics and I practice the soft skills of how to motivate a group, it just makes people look a lot more appealing. So in addition to the desire to give back, the desire to use your skills in a different way, there was a really positive impact And I would be surprised if this idea didn't translate very nicely to all your classes out there that you're thinking about using section leaders for.
Yeah, from the standpoint of a spectrum of instruction, right? It's in some sense we're all teachers, right? We all teach in some way. Like if we're parents, we teach our kids. If we're in the workplace, we teach our coworkers. But there's a group of people whose job is teacher, right? And that creates a whole bunch of structure around what you needed to do to have that be your profession. You needed to go to school. You needed credentialing. You needed to, show people that you could actually teach. And there's a huge gap between the informal teaching that we all do and the formal teaching that requires that kind of credentialing and career path. And in that space is the ability to say, we're going to have something that has a bit of structure around it, but isn't a commitment for your whole career and is something that is more formal than when you're talking to a coworker. And so the filling that void is exactly the kind of thing that Chris is talking about, why there's such a huge demand is we don't have a spectrum traditionally of teaching opportunities, and being able to fill that middle area, actually there's a lot of demand for the ability to partake in it.
Julie, have anything to add?
I also think it was that bringing that community together, they were really able to teach each other too, right? So we were able to kind of do a lot of professional development opportunities for the section leaders themselves. So sort of toward the end, we scheduled a whole bunch of talks, right, where section leaders who themselves were doing interesting and crazy things all around the world, right, were open to meeting with groups of section leaders who wanted to hear more about that. How did you get involved in web? Do you teach in K through 12, right? Are you doing, outreach into a community that's underserved, right, or dealing with challenges? We had someone to explain to us about working in an environment where they don't always have electricity, and so how can you do physical simulations of to teach kids about logic and programming and thinking, right, when you maybe don't have the resources that we're used to enjoying out here in our privileged West world, right? So so many neat things that happen in the exchange between them, and well as us bringing people from Stanford and our colleagues in to help talk them through. And so we did. I have a number of people who this started them on a path that led to more incorporation or a career switch that brought them into or more toward teaching from where they were. And that was super exciting to us, right? Was to help facilitate that growth for them.
So you have, before we go to Young's question, you have a synchronous session every week for an hour by a vetted volunteer, right? Is that right? Mm-hmm. Doing interactive kinds of things. Yeah. What do you mean by interactive synchronous sessions? Other people watching the show are doing synchronous, trying to get it to be interactive.
I mean, we really did what we think of as like a recreation of what we do in our Stanford residential course, right? It's like you brought together people at a time and place, right? We were using a tool called OYA, which is like a Zoom on steroids, right? It was like bringing people together, gathering around a table. We had a collaborative online coding environment, right, that we could work on problems together, right? You had video and audio, right, to be able to talk, and a whiteboard where you could be sketching things, right, and having people kind of huddle in small groups to talk about things and come back. So just really the whole, in person, the same group of people you would see each week in the same section leader, so you get a little bit of bonding and community in your small group as well, right, as the larger sort of ed forum and lectures where the whole community was sort of seeing the same materials in that context, but the small group was you and your section leader.
Young?
Yeah, so this is it's quite fascinating because, as you know, there's a lot of new, I mean, actually not new, 30, 20 years existence of this large scale distributed learning communities, for video games, for fan fiction. Early on we had invited two professors from University of Washington talking about fan fiction, and of course, massive online, open courses, but yours seems to have is more structured, more guided, and so this is lower attrition rate so I appreciate this model. Now my question really has to do with apparently right now you guys are doing this as volunteers. You're relying on Stanford resources, you're doing the volunteers. So the first question is how long do you think you can do this? And second question, Randy, is more actually it's a bigger challenging question, even for everybody to think about. Python, I'm sure Python, you cannot teach them in 6 weeks. You cannot teach everything in Python in 6 weeks. So would you be able to inspire others or yourself to add more courses? I think this is significant because especially for people in developing countries where they do not have the resources, this is tremendous help. When Russia is is attacking Ukraine, we don't like to see that happening. I see this as truly humanitarian activities. But again, one course is not going to cut it. So where do you see this going to happen?
So the first 2 times we did this, we did it on a shoestring. But then I mentioned that somebody has now decided to fund us. So they funded us to do it 3 more times. So for the next 3 years, we're going to have a code in place. Is it springtime? Do you want to learn Python? Come join us. Do you want to practice teaching? It's the best thing. And so for funding, that's how we hope to be sustainable. In terms of growing into more material, that would be fantastic. I think we'd like to give people who finish the course some idea of what they could do next. And there's a simple way we could do that, and just make more stuff for them to do. But then maybe I could speak quickly to the grassroots idea of education. It would make us really happy if people looked at our course and be like, section leading, what a wonderful idea. And if they could, bring that to their own community, and that idea could spread and other people could give courses. We don't need to teach everyone programming, though we will keep growing what we offer.
Yeah, I think it is natural that it'll grow over time. It's just, from the flip side, it's a matter of time of producing the materials and the courses. But it's something that we hope, it's not just us, right? We also hope to inspire other people to build follow-on courses, to have different kinds of pathways through. And that's actually what we did in the first 2 offerings of the course was, beyond our own material. At the end of the course, there were a lot of students who wanted more. And so we curated a list of other kinds of classes and experiences they could have, because, we don't think of this as just a Stanford experience. We think of this as a stepping stone to a journey through education. And so we are more than happy to be part of a community where we can point people to other things done at other places and universities and say, there's a lot of stuff out there. Here are some things we recommend, but do what works for you to get to the place you want to get to.
One of the frequent questions we ask all of our guests deals with, as the pandemic recedes, are there things learned from your experience that you're going to incorporate into the more business as usual parts of university functioning? And I'm curious as to whether there are insights that have come from doing this that you see changing aspects of the residential course.
I'll start with that a little bit, if you guys don't mind. It's just, I think one of the things that was so stark to me, right, was how much I took for granted the equalizing forces of being a residential campus and everyone having, a quiet place to work, a place to sleep, food, right, having a lot of the daily needs being supported and taken care of. And then as students were scattered back to their home environments, right, around the world in different time zones and in very different circumstances, it became so apparent that our students were coming from a really, really much more diverse set of backgrounds than we had appreciated, in our prior lives. And in Code in Place, that became, even more magnified, right, by how much broader the reach was and all of the students we had. And so it really has caused us, I think, to think long and hard about the ways that we teach to a certain ideal of what our student has, where they're coming from, where they're going to, and what they need to get there, right, is so much bigger than what we really have paid much attention to. And as Maren talked about, well, the anomaly being the oddball student, right, isn't the oddball student at scale. And so really thinking about all the modalities for like people needing accessible assignments, right? Needing, to supply recordings and time shifting, right? And different forms of learning and support and tutorial resources for people at different stages and at different places and needing different kinds of support. And that's really changed what we do at Stanford in our own courses, and will certainly continue to be reflected in what we're trying to do in Code in Place. Like one of the things, Chris had alluded to is like trying to figure out how the one size fits all. We're very synchronous and trying to keep on that thing. We felt like there was a lot of unity in that, but that didn't work for everybody. And so we're trying to think about ways to support some alternative paths too. and sort of catch more students rather than leave them behind.
Anyone else want to jump in before I ask another question?
Well, maybe just to follow up on Julie's point, and this is something that is a broader question, I think, for how we structure traditional education. Which, when Julie was talking about how some people get left behind, was this notion. I have to give credit to Peter Norvig, who originally suggested this analogy, which is normally we think of education like flying on a plane. You get in at the beginning, you go to the destination, you get off at the end, and if you get off in the middle, it's catastrophic, right? And really what we're thinking about is students need to get from point A to point B in their learning. It doesn't have to be an airplane. It could be something like a bus system. You get on the bus, you make some progress. Something comes up in life, there's complications, whatever, you get off the bus, you wait for the next bus, and you get on from the place you were at and keep moving. And so it's an opportunity in a different sort of model that isn't constrained by a fixed period of time to say you can still reach your destination, but it's a much more flexible model in terms of dealing with life events that come up. And these were the things that we saw with 10,000 students at scale, right? It's something has come up and I need to get off the bus, but I would like to get back on in 2 weeks. How do I do that? And our traditional educational structures don't do that very well. And this is one of the things that we're trying to think about, both how we do it for Code in Place, but what it might mean for educational structures more broadly.
So we hear a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when we listen to people talk about MOOCs, for instance, it's all about typically about access. And often we aren't thinking about cultural sensitivity and personalization and other kinds of things, but it sounds like you are. Or maybe it evolved to be that way. It wasn't maybe intentional, but you've talked about the supports, the tutorials, the recordings, the alternative paths. And so I'm kind of wondering whether you've thought about summarizing this somehow into an article, or if you are working on any articles, where do you intend to publish this work, if you do at all, or where could people find you? And what kind of conferences do you attend, and what might they do if they want to sit in and listen to you? So have you thought about turning this into a book chapter or a journal article of some kind, or do you have them in progress? And where might people look for that?
Maybe I can speak to that. Yeah, there are a couple papers we have written. I think we wrote a paper on the first Code in Place. There's actually, this is something we haven't talked about, but a few papers on some of the AI that was used in Code in Place. And I put some links in the chat for those who might be interested. You mentioned cultural sensitivity, and here's an interesting little anecdote that might be interesting to the viewers. Before Code in Place, we had a separate program called CS Bridge. And here's how it worked. We would go to a university, let's say in Istanbul, and we would co-teach with that university. We would take a bunch of our students and some professors, and we would co-teach with a bunch of their students and their professors, and we would find 200 students locally, and we would teach together. And this happened for maybe 8 years before Code in Place. We did it in Istanbul, Prague, Colombia, West Africa, all sorts of places around the world. And that was a really important function for us, learning what was useful cross-culturally. And we learned a lot from the people in Istanbul, Prague, and Bogota about what folks find interesting and what materials was resonating.
Thanks for sharing that chat window. Maybe Punya can put that also in the YouTube channel for our viewers in there. Maran or Julie, you want to add anything about diversity, equity, inclusion, cultural sensitivity, or your plans for the future of turning this into, something else?
Well, the cultural context, obviously, in education makes a huge difference, what people want to get out of it. But one of the things you also see in that diversity is that there are different issues in those different contexts, right? And being aware of that. And so just to give you one example that's not necessarily from Code in Place, although Code in Place is reflective of that. A while back, we were having some conversations with some people from the Middle East, specifically in Iraq, who were talking about computer science education there. And we were talking about some of the gender imbalance issues. And about 5 minutes into this conversation, it became clear to us that what we were talking about in terms of gender imbalance was completely different in the United States versus in Iraq. And the reason is that in the United States, computing is a male-dominated subject. In Iraq, it's actually a female-dominated subject because women can do the work from home. And because of the social dynamics there and the way things are set up, they actually have a skew that is like our skew, but just with the genders flipped. And so when you think about that notion of how do we get more inclusivity, how do we get more diversity, how do we get a more level playing field, it's just interesting to think about how those issues are different in different contexts, because one thing that we might want to try to do here and spread out everywhere may not actually be reaching the real issues everywhere, right? We need to have people on the ground, like when Chris alluded to CS Bridge, right? They worked closely with people in those locales to understand those issues. So the progress they could make was very context sensitive.
So I love that little anecdote, Mehran, because historically, computer science itself was a very female-dominated field before it became cool. And then you start seeing women leaving, and it becomes a completely, most of the pioneers of computer science, going back to Ada Lovelace, in fact, were women. So I think that's super interesting. Can I ask a question, Kurt? Do you have something? Okay. So let's say, I think Zhao sort of asked that question, if other people are looking at sort of expanding it into not just computer science, but other domains. So I'm just curious. So one is sort of this 1:10 is to, when you have that sort of a pyramid scheme that you talked about. What would be some other lessons that they should take away from this, from what you guys have experienced? If somebody wants to do it in some other field altogether, right? Because I can see this, I can see this in the STEM disciplines for sure, but there's no reason to restrict it to that. It could be history or writing, and so what would be some things that they can take away that you would offer them? We're looking at the time, so if you could get like a couple from each of you, we would get some really good pointers for our listeners.
I say humans. Start with humans, right? It's tricky. As computer scientists, right, we tend to think of how we can write programs that solve things and how we can make intelligent tutors or how we can make, tools that help students work through problems. But I think if you look at what's really at the heart of Code in Place is humans. And the fact that Chris said when he proposed it to our university, it was as a community service project, right? It was, this is a way for people to get involved and help out the world at large, right? And that in itself drove so much of what happened there. So don't just pay attention to the humans that you're serving, the humans that you're inviting in, and make sure that's the primary sort of focus of what you're trying to do. There's lots of cool technologies that got sprinkled in, and Chris mentioned a few of them, really cool things we can do with AI, and we had this guided feedback that we did the second time, all these really cool things. But in the end, I think the center at that heart is all about the humans.
We'll give a new one, but I want to start by plussing what Julie said. She's 100% right. It's the most important thing to take away. And as the world thinks about the future of education, Code in Place is meant to be an experiment that shows one possible direction we could go in. And having gone through it, as an AI researcher, I believe that this is the future for scaling education. The scalability of education, I don't think is going to come from GPT-4. I think it's going to come from us realizing that the number of people who want to teach is roughly proportional to the number of people who want to learn. And it's going to lead to a very human, very scaled, very healthy learning experience for our children. Though you asked for some good pointers for people who want to do this again, so I will add another one. This came from Mehran. When I was talking to Mehran, he said, if we want to do this, we need to have a process for everything. So in addition to humans, like whenever we could imagine something going wrong, we want to have a process. Like, here's the form you fill out. Oh my gosh, use all the Google Docs that you possibly can, and build processes for everything you can imagine.
And just related to that, sorry, go ahead.
No,
I'd certainly +1 the human point. I think that's critical. The technologies just basically provide a way to be able to scale a little bit more. And I think one of the things that's critical to what we do, and what Chris talked about and what Julie talked about, is there's a lot of technology that's being developed, and that technology can't be developed just for the sake of technology. It needs to be developed with people who care about teaching, who understand the context, and really are cognizant of the ways that technology augments the human. because we have no technology right now that's as good as a human teacher, right? That's as good as you can get. That's the state of the art. And rather than trying to worry about how do we replace that, what we should actually be trying to worry about is how do we augment it to make it better, and how do we figure out ways that allow that human teacher to scale and help more students in the process.
So this is quite well. Can't believe time is flying by. So quickly, we are the bunch of us, the full host of us, are all in education. Okay, so we study pedagogies, we study methods, all those kind of things. So I just want to ask you, I'm sure there are different ways to teach Python, teach computer programming, right? So you guys have picked up one. Do you think the model doing this online, large scale, limits your pedagogical approaches, or does it enhance? I mean, it could be both, but you would willing to share some of thoughts on that?
Jump in. I think it enhances it. I think one of the reasons that we haven't spoken about for why we want to do this is we want to learn about what works. And this is a great experiment. Not everything we tried worked perfectly, but we get to iterate and improve our own pedagogy. We get to learn what it means to teach somebody in Ethiopia and all over the world. We get to think about how we could do things better in a very meaningful context. I think that motivates us in a deep way. I actually do want to take a moment, since we're getting close to the end, to say thank you to Mehran and Julie and all the other wonderful people that we get to work with, because we're on a wonderful experiment. It's got all its challenges to overcome, and it's just been the best to have such a great team to work with.
Yes, and many thanks. I mean, Chris is really the spiritual leader of this whole effort, right? Like it really comes from a place in the heart that is deep and meaningful. And I think, Chris lights up a room. And when Chris stood up and said, let's do this project, who's with me? The outpouring of support we got from our current students, our past students, from anybody who's ever even just watched a podcast with Chris, right? He is his call was heard by everyone. I think everyone who hears and wants to be a part of this is welcome. So I'm going to put the little plug here. It says, if you're interested in being a learner in Code in Place, if you're interested in being a teacher in Code in Place, please look us up. It'll be happening this spring, and we want all of you to come along with us for this adventure.
And related to that point, I think it is a testament to the people you work with and how you feel mission aligned with them has so much of an impact on how you spend your time, how effective you can really be, how smoothly processes move. And to reiterate what Julie said, I mean, it was joy to work with Chris and Julie on this. It really was. It made teaching more, even teaching in the classroom at Stanford, it made that more enjoyable. The processes that we would develop for various kinds of things and figure it out was just more fun to have. But in the overall scheme of things, I'd say one of the learning experiences in terms of how it affected our pedagogy was, ultimately, if you could teach one-on-one with a person, that's almost ideal. But you can't scale that. So if you really want to scale, you need to think about how, in the cases that someone really needs that experience, can they get it? And that's where we saw the community come together through the online forum. There were some people who really used the forum extensively, and you would think like people would get tired of their questions or whatever. No, there was just other people who were willing to put in the time to get those people the more personalized help they needed. And then for the students who didn't need as much personalized help, right, they got sort of the level of support that was appropriate for them. And so I think that's one of the things that we're trying to get more learning from, is how do you distribute resources in a way or create structures in a way where the people who really need more help can get it, and the people who are fine with less can still move through the program without interruption.
I want to thank you guys for a great show.
Hold on, Kurt.
Go ahead.
Quote, we have Patrick Dixon, who was a very early PhD from Stanford, who wrote some comments on this. You want to read that, Kurt?
I can do that. I have it open here.
Yeah.
So Patrick Dixon is a former colleague of both Zhao and myself from Michigan State. So Patrick wrote, wonderful, the passion that you all bring to teaching combined with a passion for expanding access. Wish we could clone you. Do you think the future may have AI versions of you that would expand your impact? And we'll take the quick 30 seconds answer on that.
We go with no. I think it's for lots of reasons. AI is going to become really intelligent in our lifetimes. And yet, why do we want humans? I think the motivation is deep. I think you want somebody who can inspire you, who you can imagine, I can become that person. And we can't become the AI. So the AI cannot motivate us. And that's why we need to invest in making our teachers as superpowered as possible.
Again, I want to thank you guys for a brilliant show. And I'm going to let Chris maybe Peach have maybe 15 seconds to promote the spring semester. Are there any new things coming if people want to sign up? Is the funder going to fund new stuff? Are you guys up to any in the future? What's coming?
Yeah, as Julie mentioned, around April 7th, we'll be doing the next installment of Code in Place, and please do come get involved. The applications will open about a month before then. There will be some new stuff. We're always trying new stuff. There will be ways that you can, when you make a program, you can share it with your friends. We will work on a few other pieces of technology. One of the things we're also thinking about is, how we can open source some of the great things that are germinating in this ecosystem. And as we mentioned, this hopefully is just the start. We hope over the next 3 years, we can make some great tools, share some great insights with the broader learning community.
Wonderful. This has been a great show, as I said, but we do need to introduce the next show, and Punya is going to take that on. So hang with us for a second while Punya introduces. Yeah.
So again, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your passion, like Patrick said in his comment. And this emphasis on sort of the human is sort of going to be extended in our next episode. So a few months ago, there was a website that started popping into my feed, and there were people and scholars and colleagues I know and respect were linking to this website called Civics of Technology. And I sort of pursued it, and I saw that the people behind this website were addressing some very critical questions about technology and its relationship to broader society and learning. And so I thought it would be a great fit to have them over on Silver Lining for Learning. So Dan Krutka and Maria Heath, two of the people behind the project, will join us next week, 5:30, the usual time, next Saturday, to tell us more about the project, its origin, where they are now, and what they see themselves doing in the future. So look forward to seeing you same time next week. And again, thank you so much. This was such a pleasure.